Doesn't look as though things have kicked off yet. Justice Raymond Zondo does appear like he's just about to speak. Of course, today it's the second day that the Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan, is giving testimony. He has a lot to say. He was very vocal when he became Minister of Finance again around state capture. And of course, he's been Finance Minister twice. He's spoken about his relationship with Tom Moyane, that the man had no accountability towards him, and that President Jacob Zuma didn't intervene, even though he was aware that the relationship had more or less broken down. He's spoken about his relationship also with the president, saying that it wasn't the best relationship at all. He says that when he was made finance minister in 2015, soon thereafter, he realized that it wasn't really the intention of the president to appoint him, but because of pressure and the financial markets crashing down, they were forced to appoint him. So unfortunately, it looks as though we don't have audio, so we may have to come out of that and then go back to it once we have that audio and continue there. Let's continue. President Cyril Ramaphosa.
The controversy there was pertaining to three individuals that accompanied Mr. Van Rooyen, but much of that interaction took place, as you would understand, between the Treasury colleagues and Mr. Van Rooyen and the individuals concerned. I believe you have Mr. Fuzile tomorrow who will elaborate on that. When looking at a transcript of a discussion or interview with the previous public protector, Ms. Maransela, I see in there I make the point that literally overnight, when a parliamentarian becomes a minister in this instance, he's able to find three people who would accompany him to his new job first thing the next morning, amongst them being two advisors. Finding advisors normally takes a bit of time in this sort of occupation. Excuse me. And I think what you will hear from the Treasury colleagues is the person who, or about the person who becomes the Chief of Staff, Mr. Whitley, Mr. Bobat, whose name appears in many different circumstances, from Trillion to Treasury to Gupta, I'm not sure where he is now, and a third person who I was told was also there. But again, you will hear probably a lot more about that tomorrow, Mr. Babaso, as well. So, if Mr. Pretorius is going to direct you there, at Annex 24, which is in N1B.
At page 481.
At 481.
You have mastered it,
I'm getting there.
So what was that page?
481.
Oh.
Do you have that?
Yes.
The article makes reference to certain questions put to Minister Van Rooyen, or Mr. Van Rooyen, depending on the time period that we're talking about. Just like to draw your attention to three of those questions. At the bottom of page 481, questions around taking the finance positions and bringing Ian Whitley and Mohammed Bobat aligned with the Gupta family as advisors to Treasury. Questions around the procedure followed in appointing Whitley and Bobat. And thirdly, questions on Whitley and Bobat's involvement in the SAA Airbus swap deal, among others. Is that the so-called controversy that you're referring to.
That's correct. And at 1143 of my statement, I then go on to indicate that apart from the reference made to the presence at the compound in Saxon World in the first part of 1143, there was a reference to the third individual, Mr. Mabaso, and Mr. Bobat's interest in SAA at the time. And he approached one of the advisors that were with me. Oh, that was with Mr. Nene, I beg your pardon, about who's dealing with the SAA matter. That's the swap deal that we referred to earlier on.
That's the deal you referred to earlier on, approved by Mr. Nene.
That's right.
Minister Nene. And then in paragraph 114.4, Minister, you deal with what is politely called sharing of a confidential Treasury document. Would you explain the context of that statement of yours, please? Where did the document come from? What was it intended to do? And where did it finally come to rest?
Again, I think Mr. Fuzile is best qualified to give you the detail, but as I understand it, this was let's call it an economic outlook document, which would indicate A, the status of the economy at that point in time, and B, what are some of the measures that could be taken to create a better environment for, but also higher levels of inclusive growth and job creation in our economy.
A strategic Treasury document.
That's right. The Treasury would, from time to time during the course of the year, Chair, produce such documents either to brief the President or to brief Cabinet or to brief the Ministers' Committee on the budget. It would provide updated numbers on the one hand that would be available, but secondly, provide a basis for debate about what actually needs to be done. So my attention was drawn to this email that is at page 500 of N1B, which just says, "Gents, finally." We can draw all sorts of interpretations, but it would appear that somebody was obviously looking for this document. So it could mean, "Gents, finally, I've got the document." Or, "Finally, I've got something useful for you." But I leave it to the Commission to draw its own conclusions about this.
In terms of your own understanding and knowledge of procedures for appointments, even of people such as ministerial advisors, would you know whether within that short space of time of Mr. Van Rooyen's appointment, these people that he brought with him would have been formally appointed as his advisors? I'm assuming there must be some documentation that must be there if they've been appointed formally, or if they can be called, I don't know if they are employees, they would have been employees, but if they would be employees of the department, so to speak.
No, it's highly unlikely, because there is a process, indicate, Chair, and the process is obviously, firstly, you take office as a minister. Secondly, you look at what the department has to offer in terms of technical or other skills. Thirdly, you might want to entertain the idea of a political cum technical advisor. Fourth, you find the individual concerned, you get their CV, you have to show that they actually justify an appointment of that sort, and some of the procedures are then prescribed in the ministerial handbook. But what it involves, in summary, is that once you have the individual, the CV, you actually, as a minister, then have to approach your colleague, the Minister of Public Service and Administration, indicate who is the person, what is the role, and what are the qualities that the person has, competencies the person has to do the job that you want them to do as advisors. There's a limit of 2 advisors per minister in most instances, but you need to provide evidence to your colleague if you want more than 2 advisors. And once you get the approval, then the individuals concerned, i.e. the advisors, are on the payroll of the institution, in this case the Treasury, and they'll form part of the budget allocation for the office of the minister. So that's the process that we would follow.
And you say it's highly unlikely that all of that would have happened within the time before the weekend.
Highly unlikely, unless there was something a special track was available.
Thank you.
Thank you. Minister Gordhan, the sequence of events which at this stage are allegations as far as the Commission is concerned, but will be dealt with in evidence fully this week, are described on page 501 and 502 of Bundle N1B. And if I could just take you there, there's quite a neat description of the allegations and the sequence of events. Do you have it?
Yes.
The first paragraph, do you have it, Chair?
You say 501?
501, which would be in the N1B.
I've got it, yeah, thank you.
The first paragraph reads, just 2 days after Des van Rooyen's disastrous appointment as Finance Minister in December last year, his team leaked a confidential government document to close Gupta associates. And then if we can go down the page to the paragraph which reads, the emails include a document prepared by the Treasury's Director General, Lungisa Fuzile, for Economics Cluster Chairman Gugila and Quinty. Is that the document you referred to?
Yes, to the best of my knowledge. I haven't seen the document, but it's fairly well described here.
Yes, the article goes on to say it details economic opportunities in Africa for South African companies, the effects of rating agencies' decisions, a breakdown of government expenditure, matters to do with state-owned companies, corruption and perceptions thereof, beneficiation and mining, as well as South Africa's 9-point plan for an economic turnaround and each department's contribution to it. The origins of the document are described as being a request from Mr. Nkwinti for input from Directors General to the cluster to prepare for a meeting of ministers on Tuesday, December 15, 2015, on how to turn around South Africa's ailing economy. These would have then fed into an ongoing cabinet discussion on the topic. And you've already given evidence about the status of documents intended for cabinet as being secret, if not top secret. The article continues on December 12, just hours after receiving the document, Whitley shared it with Bobat and ESSA's former business partner, Malcolm Mabaso, who was Special Advisor to Mineral Resources Minister Mosebenzi Zwane. And then over the page, if I may continue briefly, Minister, he began the email simply, gents, finally. Bobat then forwarded the email to Wood, his former boss in the private sector, as well as another unknown non-governmental email address. Wood is the CEO of Trillion Capital Partners, a company owned by ESSA. A senior government official said the leak was a serious breach, as any documents known to be intended for cabinet consumption were treated as confidential and received an even higher classification once they became cabinet memos. Does that description accord with your own information or memory of the incident?
That's my understanding, yes.
If we may then go, Minister, to the New Age budget breakfast cancellation that you referred to in paragraph 115, if you would just give the Chair a brief background to New Age and New Age breakfasts and the relationship between those events and government attendees and finances?
I'll do that, Chair. As a prelude to this, may I indicate to you that what Mr. Pretorius has just read allows us to connect two dots. What I said at paragraph 80 about the takeover of the Treasury and the purpose of that. And you can see here how on day one, literally, information begins to leak to Gupta-associated entities. I said to you earlier also in relation to the Hawks that there's surprising inaction on very old information that's available in the public domain. To the best of my knowledge, Mr. Woods hasn't been charged with the fact that, or any of the others, with the fact that they have been transacting on confidential government documentation. In this case, fairly sensitive, because it begins to indicate possibilities and plans that government has in mind to refloat the economy, and which people who engage in trading, as they call it, would be able to capitalize on. Just to connect those two dots for you. At 115, another decision which I believe may have contributed to my eventual removal as Minister of Finance in March 2017 was revealed on the 21st of February 2016, 3 days before the budget was presented to Parliament, when the Sunday Times newspaper reported the National Treasury had cancelled the Gupta-owned the New Age newspaper's sponsorship of and participation in the post-budget breakfast briefing. What this refers to, Chair, is that Minister Manuel had set a tradition over the years at Treasury that after the budget, the following morning in particular, there would be this post-budget breakfast, and it would be transmitted live by one or other TV station, usually the SABC, but more latterly ENCA had an opportunity there as well. At a particular point in time, New Age, i.e. the Guptas, and SABC had a, if you like, close shop arrangement that they would be the ones that would do these sorts of transmissions. Particularly, they started with these sorts of breakfasts after the State of the Nation address that the President delivers. I'll make reference to that later on. And one or other SOE, usually ESCOM or Transnet, would sponsor those breakfasts. And the beneficiaries obviously would be New Age, which would get reasonably free advertising in the process. And these were some of the occasions on which ministers, that is the post-SONA breakfast, that ministers would accompany the President, and sometimes from the platform he would refer questions that are asked to him to a particular minister that could include me as well to answer. In this particular instance, we decided at the Treasury that we don't want to be part of that arrangement. And implicit in that, if not explicit, is the fact that we don't want anything to do with the Guptas. And we then didn't pursue that formula of New Age and SABC. We said that we would give others an opportunity. And during my term of office, we attempted that in many different ways, And in this instance, as 115 points out, both SABC and ENCA were given the opportunity to rotate the broadcasting of these breakfasts, which had become quite popular in terms of giving both ministers on the one hand, but business people in particular, but other constituencies as well, an opportunity to interact, ask questions, and then the public more generally to view that.
Thank you. Is it correct or not correct that on occasions ministers even paid for the privilege of attending the breakfasts?
Not to the best of my recollection. I wouldn't have.
there may be evidence to that effect at some stage.
Not that we look for free opportunities, but...
Then would you deal with the exchange that you had with Mr. Jonas in March, well, in October 2015, but just by way of background, deal with the issues in paragraph 116 of your statement, please.
So these were a number of interactions, Chair, between about October 2015 and post the budget of 2016, but in particular from October to the end of December with Mr. Jonas, and you've heard him already in this regard, that A, he had been at a meeting with two individuals, Shlongwane and Zuma, the young man, and one of the Gupta brothers, that he had been offered the finance minister's job and the amount of money, 600 million rands in a bank account somewhere, and 600,000 rands in a brown bag, that, or whatever color bag it was, that was available on that occasion. Secondly, he did sometime close to that interaction with the people concerned and the offer being made, he called me and said he'd like to see me, and we arranged, I think it was a Sunday evening, when we finally met, and my wife was present for parts of the discussion as well, because it was at my house, and he appeared very distraught and upset and wanted to resign and so on. So we had these discussions, which then became clearer over time that this was a very serious offer. And then, if you like, the pennies dropped when Mr. Nene was dismissed as to what all of this was about. It was about, in a sense, already knowing that Mr. Nene is going to exit. It was about preparation for somebody to take his place. And the preparation involved finding, if possible, a compliant individual to take over that particular position. And if it involved money, well, so be it. I mean, in the overall scheme of things, 600 million rands, it looks big, but when you have billions at stake, and I think in that conversation, he was told by whoever amongst the Gupta brothers was present that you know, we've got 6 billion rands from the state. Next year we want 8. I don't know where they thought they'll end up by now, but we'll take that for what it's worth. So 600 million rands to have 3 or 5 years of a compliant individual who would overlook, or rather not look too carefully at various transactions like Danel Asia and others, would be hugely beneficial to, let's call it the Gupta complex in this particular instance. We then move across 2015 into 2016, and what happens is a new concern now. When does he talk about it publicly? And clearly now we're heading for budget time. We've had the difficulties of familiarizing ourselves in a very short period of time, as I indicated, with the budget documentation and direction and numbers. And secondly, both of us are very committed, as with the Treasury staff, to not doing anything disruptive or sending the wrong signals to the public and to investors as well, i.e. that there was a possible manipulation, which in any event happened once Mr. Van Rooyen took over for those 2 working days. So we decided that he would keep quiet and let the budget period pass, and then of course we are familiar with the fact that he made a public statement in this regard, which then started its own cycle of events as well, and increasingly made the Treasury more of a target, so to speak, for some of the activities that we saw from law enforcement and other agencies. So that's summing up a period of time.
Thank you, Minister Gordhan. The evidence from Mr. Jonas's point of view has already been given to this commission, and unfortunately we need to go into some detail. Our term of reference concerning the events concerning Mr. Jonas and Ms. Mentor expressly requires us to examine the veracity of the allegations made by Mr. Jonas and Ms. Mentor. And for that reason, I just want to ask you a few questions about his version of events and what he reported to you on your version of events. Mr. Jonas's version appears at page 38 of the supplementary bundle. It's common cause that he reported to you, let me say at the outset. And
I'm sorry, you said page 38?
Of the supplementary bundle. N2.
I've got 38.
Paragraph 34 of the statement of Mr. Jonas.
I guess a portion of his statement.
A portion of his statement, yes. He says there, Minister Gordhan, he says that on Sunday the 25th of October, he spoke to you and asked if he could see you to seek advice and guidance. That is, Mr. Jonas went to your house in Pretoria, and when he arrived, you were sitting with your wife. He then goes on to say, and I quote, "Given that his wife was present, I decided to provide him with a high-level outline of what had happened. I told him that I had been invited to a meeting and that the individuals present at the meeting had told me that I would be made Minister of Finance and that they had offered me money and that I had refused their offer. I was still deeply shocked, angered and dispirited, and told him that I thought I should submit my resignation the following day." Your evidence is that he did not disclose specific detail about what had caused him to be so distraught on that Sunday on which he met you at your Pretoria home in the presence of your wife. And I understand your evidence to be that that evidence was supplemented, or that information was supplemented at a later stage. So the only difference in the version that certainly is apparent to us is that Mr. Jonas says he told you the detail, albeit at a high level, if that's consistent. On this first occasion he met and related the story to you. Your version seems to be that he did not give you detail on the first occasion, but supplemented that version later with more detail.
Well, Mr. Pretorius, is that right, or am I missing something? To say Mr. Jonas says he told Mr. Gordhan details. He says he told him a high outline, and I was thinking that that's not detail, but I may be wrong.
Well, yes, leaving aside what high outline might or might not mean, the narrative continues just after halfway down paragraph 34 on page 38, to say that he told Minister Gordhan of the invitation of the individuals present, the offer to be made Minister of Finance, and the offer of money.
Okay. I thought the preface given that his wife was present was meant that he wasn't going to give him as details, but from what comes after that, maybe.
Well, that may be the explanation, Chair.
Yeah.
It may indeed be the explanation, and perhaps Minister Gordhan should be grateful to you for that.
Okay, thank you.
I don't want him to cause domestic trouble now. So just for the record, Chair, 117, 1, 2, and 3, and 4 are consistent with 34 and 35. It's only the question of when the details, and they appeared as I was giving my summary over time, and I might have even got some of the, let's call it extreme details, more after the budget in preparation for his statement on the 16th of March.
Yeah, well, thank you.
And I might just say for the record of events as you have set out in paragraph 117 is consistent with the transcript of your own evidence before the public protector. Then if we may proceed to your evidence in regard to your interaction with Gupta family members, and if you would tell the Commission about that issue and the record of your communications or interactions with members of the Gupta family. You deal with it at paragraph 118.
No, thank you. If I may firstly, Chair, state a few things for the record, and then I'll make reference to the paragraphs that Mr. Pretorius makes reference to. Because of the leakage of the statement, a lot of the focus for people looking for sound bites has been trivialized into, did you meet the Guptas or not? Not what did you do with them? Not who else have you met and entered into any corrupt or let's call it unsavory deals. And it's important for me to provide as much clarity and definiteness about this particular issue. So let me start by saying that I was asked to address this issue by the Commission. It's not that I wanted to hide it. As far as I'm concerned, this set of interactions I'm going to talk about are fairly trivial in the overall context. As far as my, I don't even want to use the word relationship with the Guptas, because there was no such relationship. So that's the first point. The second is what I said earlier on, Chair, that I want to make it absolutely clear that whatever the interactions might have been, there was no so-called meeting where two people sit, they transact. There were interactions, or we happened to be in the same place, and I'll come back to that point in a moment. And so I'm quite emphatic about the fact that I'm not for sale or influence. If I was, then I'll be sitting in a very different capacity. The third point is that, according to my office at the time in the Treasury, there were repeated efforts to try to meet me or get me into a meeting, all of which either the office turned down, or if I was informed about it, I turned down. So at no stage would I have entertained a meeting directly with the Guptas. The fourth point is that I've never been to Saxonwold, the so-called compound. nor, by the way, as I indicated earlier, did I look for the shebeen in its vicinity. I've never been to the wedding and did not take any cognizance of the so-called invitation. I think we did describe what the invitation looked like. So it was a fairly sizable box lying on the desk of my PA. I'm told, I checked this morning, I'm told it had some fruit of some kind. I might have said earlier it had condiments and a very fancy invitation. And with due respect to the invitation, it finally found its way to the wastebasket, which is where it should belong. The fifth point is that I've had no direct one-on-one meetings with the Guptas, and I hope the media gets this clear. Now, it appears that the narrative that we are buying into in the public domain is that if you are wearing a white or a blue shirt and there happens to be a little dot, then it's no longer white or blue. So a bit of ink fell on it, and then it contaminates the whole color. So yes, as I say in the statement, I have seen them at cricket matches on one or two occasions. I've seen them at, and a relative of mine said, tell the Commission, even ice cream vendors are at the cricket match as well. So that doesn't mean that they've had meetings with the Guptas. And as I indicated earlier on, there were these post-SONA New Age SABC breakfasts sponsored by one or other SOE, and we were required to be there to support the President, and that was the capacity in which I was present at that. And that would mean that we were sitting in the same room as about this size at 50 different tables, and they might be sitting with the President. I've had meetings with Mr. Ambani as a business person and a billionaire from India who runs a communication company called Reliance Communications, and there are documents in one of the packs here, which I'll come back to, which show the number of efforts by both his company and Bharti Airtel to enter into some kind of transaction with MTN. And the reason I agreed to meet with Mr. Ambani is because he could be a potential investor in South Africa. So a Gupta, according to Mr. Makhajane, was present. The fact that I don't even remember this person being there shows you the amount of significance I have attached to it. It's not about hiding, it's about not giving any cognizance to that fact. And so I agreed to meet Mr. Ambani as a potential investor in South Africa. So at 1:23, Chairperson, I clarify let me say at 122.1, the second instance apart from these public occasions was when, as I described in 122.1, I had a meeting where I was requested to be at a meeting with the President, and you've been to Mashlambo and Lobo, so you know that there are many different rooms. I was waiting in another room for a while for the President to finish whatever earlier engagement he had. I was then asked to go to the room where he was present, and I find this short gentleman sitting there, and I'm introduced to him, or he's introduced to me by the President as his friend, and so Gupta, and that he has some expertise in small business and finance. As a courtesy to the President, I didn't want to say I don't want to talk to him. I listened to whatever little comments he wanted to make about business and finance for about 2 minutes, and I think it became quite evident to him that I'm not interested, and he left, and my meeting with the President continued. So that's what I describe in 122.1.
Is that the same meeting that is referred to in 122 on the previous page?
Let me check that. Yes, 122.1 is an elaboration of that.
Thank you. You were going to deal with the meeting with Mr. Ambani.
Yes. So at paragraph 123, Chair, if I may read that on the record.
Yes.
I had forgotten of another instance where one of the Gupta brothers may have been present at a meeting I had with billionaire Indian businessman Anil Ambani of the Reliance Group of companies in or about June 2010. And the documentation in the PAC's, Chair, will show you that the Ambani brothers were in South Africa to attend World Cup matches, the FIFA World Cup matches. I stress that I do not recall the details set out below, since it proved to be a meeting of little significance at the time, but have been assisted in this regard by my former Chief of Staff, Mr. Mokajane. At 123.1, I say the following. I am told that the Presidency put Mr. Rajesh Tony Gupta in touch with Mr. Mokajane. Mr. Gupta called Mr. Mokajane repeatedly, asking for a meeting with me. However, he never advised Mr. Mokajane who would be at such a meeting and what the agenda for the meeting was to be. We were even asked to attend the meeting at the Gupta family compound in Saxonwold. I refused to schedule a meeting with the Gupta family, whether at their residence or anywhere else. So let me repeat that sentence. I refused to schedule a meeting with the Gupta family, whether at their residence or anywhere else. 123.2, eventually Mr. Gupta told Mr. Mokajane that one of the Ambani brothers from the Reliance Group of companies in India wished to meet me, and that it was concerning a possible MTN transaction. Bharti Airtel had called off merger talks with MTN both in 2008 and again in 2009, and Reliance Communications was reported to have been interested in pursuing the acquisition of MTN during 2009. We were advised that Mr. Ambani was in South Africa for the 2010 Soccer World Cup, which I indicated earlier, and that he would like to meet me regarding the possible MTN transaction. At page 511 of N1B, there are a number of copies of press reports that would support what I'm saying. The next paragraph says, I agreed to a meeting with Mr. Ambani, who had the potential to be a significant investor in South Africa. The meeting was held at a hotel in Pretoria, Veracity, on a Sunday morning. I attended the meeting together with Mr. Mokajane, who advises me that the meeting lasted less than an hour. Discussions in the meeting were between Mr. Ambani and I. It commenced with general conversations about the World Cup, the Ambani family's visits to Kruger National Park, and Indian and global politics. Just for a bit of gossip, the two brothers in the family were in a huge disagreement at the time, and the Kruger National Park provided the venue where they reconciled, from what the reports say. I don't think they got any counseling from me in that regard. At 123.5.4, eventually Mr. Ambani asked about the legal and regulatory processes that would be required to obtain approval for a transaction such as the purchase of MTN, and we spoke in general terms of what processes would need to be followed and the role of the National Treasury. The meeting ended inconclusively, and we parted ways and left. Mr. Mokajane has advised me that he recollects that Mr. Ajay Gupta was present at the meeting. I do not recall him being present.
So before you go on, may I just ask, Minister, do you now recall whether he was present or not with hindsight? Alternatively, do you accept what Mr. Mokajane says, that he was in fact present? That is Mr. Ajay Gupta.
The alternative. I accept Mr. Mokajane's view. He's younger, so his memory is better. Then, Chair, if at all any so-called credentials are required, I'm departing from the statement in terms of my standing in relation to the Guptas. Let me reiterate what I've said. No visits to their compound, the New Age breakfast cancellation prior to the 2016 budget is evidence of my attitude. The refusal by myself and the Treasury to have any part of Minister Zwane's attempts to get some kind of intervention going in the bank accounts being closed, which I think are still to come to. The court action that actually followed in relation to these accounts, where I sought a declarator from the Pretoria High Court in North Gauteng. And, for example, my refusal and the Treasury's refusal to have anything to do with Anil Asia on the basis that we were being pressured to do are all a few of the indicators about where I stood in relation to this particular issue. Finally, in relation to 123.7, I intend to write to the Speaker to clarify the issues in respect of the parliamentary question from the Democratic Alliance, as I indicate in 123.7. It is apparent in my written response that I do not make mention of the 2010 meeting with Mr. Ambani of the Alliance Group, which a Gupta brother may or may not have attended. This is simply because at the time of submitting the written response, I had no recollection of the meeting. But to emphasize, that meeting was with Mr. Ambani, not with a Gupta representative.
So your reply appears at page 526 of Bundle N1B, and you say you wish to refer the Commission to that reply. May I ask you to turn to page 526 of the bundle?
Yes.
Perhaps you could read the question, parliamentary question from the DA onto the record and your reply.
So, yes, so I confirm that that was a reply, and I've given the context that I was meeting Mr. Ambani, not Mr. Gupta, or whichever of them was present. And this is in a context, Chair, as you would understand, as Minister of Finance, which we pointed out to you, on behalf of the country, would be meeting hundreds of investors, overseas business people, rating agencies, and so on. And this was just one amongst many meetings at the time. And the second point that the Commission would want to look into is that it's during this period that the Guptas and South African business people would complain about this. That the Guptas would want to demonstrate to particularly Indian business people, but others as well, that they are the sole channel, if you like, to gain access to higher office in South Africa. And I must try and recall some names, if I can, of people who've been on a state visit to India, for example, where the Guptas would be very clear that if you want to meet either the South African side or the Indian side, theirs is the channel that needs to be utilized. It's in this way that they were able to manage patronage, if you like, at both ends of the equation as well. So finally, let me just reiterate that I'm not for sale to anybody.
Just to close the loop and to put the proposition to in its most extreme form, if you'll forgive me, Minister Gordhan, it has been put that, in fact, you did not forget at the time you made the reply and you misled Parliament. What is your answer to that?
Well, I've given the answer already.
Thank you.
That then you accuse, or well, whoever it is that is putting the question, is not telling me that I'm lying, and I would not lie to Parliament. So if I wanted to lie, by the way, I could have left this meeting out of the submission to you, Chair, and you wouldn't be any wiser about it. So the fact that it's here and it's declared, and the fact that this was a meeting with Mr. Ambani is evidence of both my efforts and my office's efforts to be frank in relation to this matter.
And the Chair has already invited those who wish to make any allegations or lead any evidence to come and do so within this forum rather than elsewhere.
I'm not sure they are hearing that voice, but that's another matter.
Well, just going back to the issue of a meeting, my understanding is, firstly, that you never had any meeting in the normal sense of the word meeting with any of the Gupta brothers.
Yes.
That's the first point. The second point you make, and that is anywhere, you know. Then the second point is you did have, I think what you may have termed in your parliamentary reply, encounters at official functions. Am I right?
That's right.
And then, of course, you mentioned that meeting with that potential investor where there was somebody from the Gupta family, but for the meeting you were having was with the potential investor.
That's right.
Yeah. And then you mention the occasion when the former president introduced to you, was it Mr. Ajay Gupta, or was it another member of the Gupta family?
Yeah,
at the
I
short
sometimes
meeting?
have difficulty distinguishing one from the other. So
Yeah, but one of
that's
them.
why I keep referring to them as the Gupta brothers, unless you want to refer to them as the Three Musketeers. But,
So where at least one of them was introduced to you.
that's right.
Yeah, and you also make the point that you have never had any relationship with them. You made that point as well.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the summary, Chair.
Thank you.
In paragraph 123.7, just to explain a possible misunderstanding of that statement, you say in line 4, you did not make mention in the DA reply of a meeting with Mr. Ambani at which a Gupta brother may or may not have attended. I understand that statement to be in the context of what Mr. Mukhajani informed you. Am I
That's right.
correct? A nod won't be recorded by the machine. Your answer is yes, I think.
Yes.
Would you then go, please, to the events of 2016, or at least return to the events of 2016, as you outline them in paragraph 124 of your statement, please?
So, in this, let me read this paragraph, Chair, with your consent, and then give some...
Are you getting to paragraph 124?
124.
Yes, Chair, 124.
Before you do so, now that you mentioned you testified that the Gupta brothers, you understood that they would conduct themselves, and I'm putting this in my own words, conduct themselves in such a way that people would think that the only way to access people in certain people in certain high office would be through them. That's right.
That's right.
Now, yeah, may I just ask, and this is a little for something else. There was a state visit to China, I believe in 2010, I may be mistaken, Do you remember whether you may have been part of that?
Not that I recall, Chair.
No. And there was one to India, state visiting.
I wasn't part of that.
You were not part of that. Oh, okay. Well, there was something I wanted to ask.
I did go to France.
Sorry?
I did go to a state visit to France okay. and to the UK.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
That takes us back, Minister, to paragraph 124, and you continue to relate the events that occurred during 2016.
Yes, I was asking for consent to read 124 into the record. So returning to the events of 2016, it was a year marked by ongoing harassment and attempted distraction of me by law enforcement agencies, some media houses, and a persistent social media campaign of fake news and personal attacks that appeared antagonistic towards me and the work being done by the Treasury. I was the target of an orchestrated campaign that appeared aimed at forcing me to resign as Minister of Finance. The role of the public relations agency Bell Pottinger was central to this orchestrated campaign, and I'm sure it is well known to the Commission. Before
you go on, just two questions, which you may answer briefly, please. The orchestrated campaign, you've referred to part of it as you describe it in your evidence today. Is there anything else by way of detail that led you to believe that it was orchestrated?
If we could get footage from ANN 7, for example, during the course of 2016, and I come to one of the issues later in the statement on the Financial Intelligence Center Amendment Bill, for example, as one illustration. So there would be sometimes ANC officials, so-called analysts, and there'll be consistently the same analyst. In some instances, at other instances, there'd be a variety of them. And that medium, including the New Age newspaper, were the two key channels through which, at one stage, the attacks were being launched against the Treasury and myself. Then the Gupta leaks reveal the role of Bell Pottinger. And I'm told, somebody needs to confirm that, they were paid to the tune of £100,000 a month to play their role. Now, one of the creations of Bell Pottinger, together with, I think it was with Mr. Duduzane Zuma, according to the emails, but I might be wrong, is this concept of white monopoly capital. So then for a whole period of time, you would see attacks which say we are white monopoly capital orientated, or bought off by white monopoly capital, or even appointed by white monopoly capital. But depending on the context and the situation, the narrative would shift in one way or another. So I was reminded of an elder family member in Durban, and I'll come back to this in some of my closing remarks as well. There's an interesting saying, it might be something in the Zulu language, in isiZulu as well. It says the tongue has no bone. Now, anatomically, that's true, right? So it's one of your most flexible instruments in your body. So you can say anything at any time because it doesn't really matter. It can go this direction or the other. In other words, contradictions and so on don't matter. So if you recall, Chair, white monopoly capital reached a peak at a particular point in time. Then the former minister in the Labour cabinet, Peter Hain, became aware of the Bell Pottinger role in South Africa. And together with investigative journalists, that role became more exposed to the public domain. The emails then helped the public to understand what was actually going on. The matter is then raised in the United Kingdom by Mr. Hain. You might want to call him as your witness as well at some stage to give you some insights into this organization and a few others and their role in state capture here. And then I think there's a public relations sort of regulatory board or institution in Britain that looks into the matter. And as I understand it, in formal terms, Bell Pottinger doesn't exist. But if you look into the history of Bell Pottinger and the manner in which that institution has related to political events in different parts of the world, it seems to have an interestingly notorious history. But to come back to South Africa, what that initiates is a whole new campaign now through the digital media. And I was watching a recorded BBC interview last night, or rather a program, with representatives of Twitter, Google, and Facebook. But this was taking place in an Indian context, and the interview was done in India before an audience. And what are each of these institutions doing to manage fake news and what we today call bots, and the manner in which that kind of digital media can be manipulated to influence, for example, the US elections. And I think you're familiar with the manner in which data collected by Facebook was then analyzed and manipulated by an institution called Cambridge Analytica. And that then enabled the campaigners for the current president in the US to target specific messages from insights obtained from the usage of Facebook. Then you have a similar phenomenon called bots, where they're automated, I'm not too familiar with this myself, but I'm learning. They're automated systems that are developed. So you feed in one message, and then a variation of that message is produced, and you can have 1,000 bots going out at a time. So the most recent example I saw of the negative effects of this and what happens when it is exposed or when Twitter acts in the right kind of way is Premier Zille saying that overnight, once she complained or something like that, 7,000 so-called followers on Twitter disappeared. So those were obviously these bots that are operating. So I think I did indicate yesterday that the Commission might benefit from a digital communication expert and how that has influenced narratives in South Africa. So the onslaught still continues even today, whether it is against members of my family, having accounts all over the show, or shares that I own, or whatever, all of which is disclosed in Parliament, by the way. There's no secrets there, in order to manipulate public opinion as well. So in 125, and rather in 124, that's the phenomenon that we are describing. And investigative journalists have also produced some interesting insights into this regard as well. And it does undermine our democracy. Fake news undermines democracies and can influence citizens to begin to do the wrong things. And you can have fairly serious consequences as a result of the choices that citizens make on the basis of what they actually fed. So that's 124, Mr. Pretorius.
You then deal, Minister Gordhan, with the effect that this campaign, as you describe it, had on yourself, your family, and others.
So in 125, we're basically saying, notwithstanding this kind of campaign to force us to resign, and in this I include Deputy Minister Jonas as well, we decided that we will resist. We will do our best to protect the institution, i.e. the National Treasury, and I must compliment the senior staff and leaders of the National Treasury. All of them, Mr. Chairperson, can walk out literally tomorrow, some of them have already, and get 3 times or 4 times the salary that they're earning, and have bonuses far in excess of anything that they will earn in government. Such is the order of the technical skills that they have. And all credit goes to Ms. Ramos and Mr. Manuel for building up the environment in which such expertise can actually operate, and such quality people can be recruited. Nobody stays in organizations for 15 to 20 years these days. And the senior management was equally committed to saying, we're going to stick it out unless and until some of us get fired. And that has helped, I think, the country up to a point. And as I say at the top of page 46, the sentiment seemed to be that we should not make it easy for them to get rid of those of us who were seen as obstacles to the state capture project and the looting of our public resources.
Would you then, please, Minister Gordhan, deal with your relationship with and your interactions with Mr. Moyane whilst you were Minister of Finance and he was SARS Commissioner?
Yeah, so I wouldn't like to call it a relationship. So, Chairperson, when you are appointed as a minister, and as we indicated, I think, somewhere in our discussions yesterday, one would expect that heads of institutions that report to the ministry would understand their role and their accountability. And I think I mentioned all of this in the context of the appointment question arising from Section 6.1 of the SARS Act. And mature leadership requires, and humble leadership requires, that when a new minister comes into office, you do the necessary. Of course, in this instance, the necessary is a bit difficult because preceding my appointment in December 2015, there were all of these leaks to the Sunday Times, some of which included attacks on myself as well, particularly on the so-called pensions issue, which seems to have a life of its own over this 2-year period. So that's the first point. The second point is that the part of that accountability would be that, let's take a very elementary thing. I am going on leave.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Mr. Gordhan. I'm going to take you back. I'm not sure whether you completed the point you were seeking to make about what happens when there's a new minister. You do the right thing, and I thought you didn't complete it.
Let me be more specific. No, thank you, Chair. No, all I was saying is that accountability to the minister means accountability to the minister, i.e., you follow simple administrative processes that are necessary. So if you want to take leave, you apply for leave on a leave form that's available in the public service. You submit it, you get your approval, you take leave. If there are difficulties, you negotiate about the date and then still take your leave. At a second level, you report on the day-to-day operational results, in this case revenue collection or enforcement actions and the consequences thereof, all of which are the annual reports of the Revenue Service. But thirdly, if you're undertaking major changes in the organization, then tell the new minister this is what is going on and find the first possible opportunity to brief the minister in that particular regard. So,
thank you.
You have the email that I made reference to earlier on, where Deputy Minister Jonas and I paid a visit to Mr. Moyane. Of course, he makes a big thing about me not shaking hands with him, but that's why I say I have no relationship, because I thought he was rude to me. When the first of the Sunday Times reports were coming out, I actually phoned him because Minister Nene was in the US for a meeting of the IMF. He didn't return my call, and that's normal protocol, is that even if another minister is calling you, you have the courtesy of returning the call. But anyway, those 10 issues, part of the 10 issues is substantial changes to the operating model of SARS, which we now, Judge Nugent has been pursuing. So I don't want to trample that ground now. Safe to say that if there is something new happening, find the first opportunity to brief the new minister, see if he or she is comfortable with where you're going, and if not, persuade the minister that this is the right thing and in the best interest of the institution. And that's simple accountability. amongst many others, that all of us would regard as normal in terms of executive accountability. So that's covered at 127.1, and 127.2 looks at the similar question. I faced further ongoing personal and institutional attacks, antagonism, and an evident lack of accountability from Mr. Moyane. Indeed, the Commission is respectfully referred to the affidavit filed in the ongoing disciplinary proceedings against Mr. Moyane for further detail regarding the deterioration of, although I mistakenly use the word here, my relationship with him. Now, those are ongoing matters between the President and Mr. Moyane, so I don't want to enter that territory. With due respect, Chair, and if Mr. Pretorius agrees.
Should the Chair be interested or concerned about the disciplinary proceedings, those appear at page 527 to 596 of bundle N1B. What happened, however, was that Mr. Moyane declared an intergovernmental dispute. Am I correct? Against you.
Yeah, one would argue that Chapter 3 of the Constitution is not meant to sort out these simple accountability matters, as I understand it. And I had the privilege of being part of drafting it as well. This is about institutional disputes at different levels, and which requires that efforts be made to resolve them before one approaches, or any institution approaches a court for a solution. But it also sets out the importance of having the right kind of relationship and interactions with and between institutions of the state. So at 127.3, I think that's the point that you are raising. At 127.4, we make reference to the former, I don't know whether he's former, but the legal advisor of the former president, who attempted to make it appear that he was going to mediate these difficulties. And I might have met him once, I think, in that context, but that was it, and nothing further emerged.
No doubt if Mr. Moyane accepts any invitation to cross-examine or question you in relation to your evidence, Minister Gordhan, he can deal with it in more detail. But the declaration of the intergovernmental dispute appears at page 599 of the bundle N1B, where he asks, interestingly, for a retired judge to appear as facilitator. It turns out that the former president's lawyer, whether at the time or not, attempted to mediate the dispute. What role did the former President Zuma play in relation to the dispute between yourself and Mr. Moyane?
None that I can recall.
Do you know whether he would have instructed Michael Hulley to mediate the dispute?
Not at first hand, he might have. But obviously Mr. Hulley wouldn't appear on the screen without his consent.
Then at paragraph 128, you deal with a communication between the then Minister of Social Development, Batabile Dlamini, and the former President Zuma that took place around June 2016. The letter is marked confidential, but it since came into your possession, as I understand it.
That's correct.
And it appears at page 603 of bundle N1B. It's a lengthy letter, and runs from 603 to 614. Do you have it there?
Yes.
The letter might be instructive insofar as it might highlight, certainly as far as the Department of Social Development is concerned, some of the issues that concerned another department and National Treasury, and it's been put up by your legal team as part of the bundle. And if I may, I'd like to draw your attention to some of the disputes or issues or contentions raised by Minister Dlamini and give you an opportunity to respond thereto. The first is the issue concerning the appointment of cash paymaster services for the payment of social grants and the withdrawal of condonation allegedly without substantive explanation and political and administrative implications that might have had, and this was a condonation granted by Treasury. Without going into too much detail, would you explain to the Chair what the issue was and your response to that issue, or the response of Treasury to that issue?
Well, I think Cash Paymaster Systems Chairperson has been very much part of your work in another capacity, and obviously has presented government with many challenges. So I can't remember the details of the condemnation, but what the letter generally illustrates in that issue as well is the kind of attacks that Treasury would be subjected to using these sorts of issues, I believe unjustifiably, to essentially say that, again, Treasury is an obstruction to what is going on. We don't want to get into the details of SASA and CPS and so on, but the Treasury colleagues, together with the Reserve Bank, I think it was in December 2016, spent an extraordinary amount of time trying to find alternate solutions other than CPS, which was an expensive option, to pay social grants and make sure that people who are recipients of grants actually get their grants in a reliable kind of way. Now later, I think somewhere in the letter there's a complaint about bias towards the private sector. But and I wasn't in those meetings, but from the reports that officials of the Treasury offered, and as you will recall, Chair, the Reserve Bank is the body that has the banking regulation function. So they would be able to get banks, for example, to cooperate on a short-term basis to distribute grants or issue cards or whatever the case might be. Treasury would be looking at the procurement issues on the one hand, but cost savings on the other hand as well. And obviously from a social development SASA point of view, their concern would be whether on a monthly basis the right amount of money would be actually paid out. And notwithstanding, I think it was late December 2016, as I say, after weeks of hard work, a solution having been either being very close to being found or found, it was all turned down. And then we get into the morass that the Constitutional Court had to eventually intervene in as well. So it again illustrates that, in a sense, we were right to raise our concerns and the manner in which this issue was being dealt with. There's still, I think, room for further investigations in terms of whether unfair benefits were obtained improperly in this context by CPS in particular, but that's for another day. There's also reference, if I may be proactive in relation to grant payments, to payments of grants in the month in which local government elections took place. And I think we were required to assist in bringing the payment date forward. Now, all that means is that we've got to make sure, as I described yesterday, that the cash is available in order to pay those grants. And as I can recall it, we did everything possible to accommodate that, because it's an understandable requirement that you don't want election date and payment date to clash in any kind of way. So that's just around the issue of SASA and the grant payments.
Yes. There are in this letter a number of issues raised by Minister Lemini in relation to SASA, the South African Social Security Agency on the one hand and Treasury on the other hand. Earlier in your evidence you gave testimony to the role and function of Treasury in the Department of Finance in relation to other departments, and how very often there were clashes and the Minister of Finance, Treasury would not always be very popular because of the different priorities that were served on the one hand by departments of state and on the other by Treasury. Is this an example of such a clash, or is there something more to it than that?
Now, the only qualification, Chair, I would make to what Mr. Pretorius has said is to the word often, because the kind of approach that certainly we try to promote is one which said that where there are difficulties or differences, let's sit around a table and find a common solution. So invariably, we would find the solution. But there would be these instances, and there Mr. Pretorius is right, where a level of intransigence will begin to enter the equation, particularly if there are other agendas at play, rather than the particular responsibility that we have at a point in time.
By way of further example, Minister, at page 605, the Minister raises the issue that officials of National Treasury seem to have more power than MinCombud itself in deciding on which government priorities get funded and which do not. Firstly, what is MinCombud?
So it's a structure I described earlier, which is that it's a subcommittee of cabinet created before my time called the Ministers' Committee on the Budget. It has normally about 6, 7 or 8 ministers. It also has Directors General of Treasury, Presidency, Planning, Monetary and Evaluation, and I think Public Service and Administration. And its responsibility is to assist the Finance Ministry and the Treasury to look at economic data, to and prepare for the approach to budgets, both the medium term and the February final budgets as well. This is where at least once a quarter you would present economic updates, and in particular ask them to help make the choices between large requests and limited resources as well. On some occasions, certainly before my time, and one or more occasions after or during my time, specific departments who make requests could even be asked to come over to the MinCombud meeting, motivate the kind of request or projects that they want to actually engage in. That is now at a ministerial level. That motivation, as I described yesterday, would still happen at an officials level in what is called the MinTech process, or MTech process.
In short, the allegation here by the Minister appears to be that officials of National Treasury exercised an overriding power, or sought to exercise an overriding power greater than that of MinCombud.
If you have 6 or 7 ministers in the room and 2 or 3 officials from the National Treasury, I mean, a huge discredit is being done to the other ministers, that they don't have the ability to hold officials to account and make their own judgments. Now, clearly, technically speaking, a person from the budget office will have fiscal expertise, and one can either both learn and engage with that expertise and correct it politically in terms of the kind of direction it is going in. There will be macroeconomic expertise that we as ministers don't have technical skills on, but where we can apply our political judgment, which is what we are supposed to do. In other words, what's in the best interest of the country at a particular point in time, taking account of both the technicalities but also the politics of the occasion.
I'm not sure that it's fair to ask you to go into the detail of every dispute raised in this letter, but there is one more aspect of this letter that I would like to put to you. On page 607, reference is made to a policy discussion and the alleged attempt by National Treasury to take over policy-making responsibilities of what the Minister refers to as our departments. And on that page, in the third paragraph, that's page 607, on page 608 in the third paragraph, and again on page 611, in broad summary, the accusation is that National Treasury adopted a position that was not in the interests of the work, certainly of her department, but rather exhibited a bias to the financial sector. That allegation appears in the third paragraph of page 607, third paragraph of page 608, where the Minister says, it has, however, become clear that the National Treasury wanted to rewrite the entire paper, that's a policy paper, based on the views of their consultant who holds the narrow interest of protecting the financial sector at the expense of the rest of our society. And similar allegations are made further on in the papers. Without going into too much detail, the overall accusation there is that the Treasury had particular interests in mind at the expense of the broader South African society. What is your response to that?
Well, at a general level, Chair, I think it's highly unfair to say Treasury is working against the interests of the country, because all the evidence points to the contrary. So that's the first point. The second is that what is referred to here is a policy document called the Comprehensive Social Security Paper/Stroke Policy. Now, the background to this is that over the democratic era, 1994, let's say up to 2010, 11, 12, South Africa has established a fairly good safety net, and is probably ahead of most developing countries in the world, i.e. we have a child support grant, disability grant, foster care grant, and if you use a slightly wider concept of the social wage involves expenditure on housing, on education, on health, and on social security and related matters. And I think I told you at some stage that in our case, there would be years in which the non-interest expenditure being taken into account, some 57% of our non-interest expenditure goes to the social wage. And that's correct given the kind of history and imbalances that we've actually had in our society. So, but there are still gaps in the social security system. So, for example, you have a large unemployed population. Now, is it possible from the fiscus to support them by providing some kind of income? What we have is the UIF, the Unemployment Insurance Fund, to which working people contribute. So all of us contribute in some way or the other. And when you are unemployed, you can draw on that fund for a year or so, as I understand it, to assist you to bide your time until you can find a job. But if you are unemployed, you don't have access to the UIF. So in terms of principle, I think it's correct that unemployed people should be supported. The question is similar to the nuclear issue. What's your fiscal capacity to be able to do so? Do you have the money? And if you start in year one, you can't stop in year two. You've got to be able to carry it forward. In the early years of Minister Manuel's time, there was the huge debate in the country about the basic income grant that some of us might remember. Now, in an interesting way, the world has gone almost 360 degrees on that issue because of the fourth industrial revolution and digitization of production. The idea is that or the prognostication is that over time you're going to get more and more unemployed people or less employed people because machines are doing their work. It worsens, some claim, with artificial intelligence and so on. Now, so the question of the state then supporting people, the citizens generally, with some kind of income grant is now, even amongst very conservative papers like The Economist, on the scene as well. But the question that nobody is still answering is, where does the money come from? So to come back to this in summary, without boring everyone, there were disagreements amongst the officials on the principle and the practicality on this approach. And there were a few other issues, I don't want to bore you with that I can recall, around how Social Security grants are paid, for example, or how do you create a common fund. So the one thought was you take all of the pension funds in the country, combine them in some kind of way, and combine them with the government pension fund, and use that as a pool of sorts that people could benefit from and that we could leverage. Now, the technicalities of that involve actuarial science, actuarial calculations, and different experts might come with different views on some of these issues. So yes, this has been a long-standing issue, but it's nothing to do with Treasury being X and Y and Z. I think if there are pragmatic people around the table, the key thing is not keep disputing it, but get on with it. Now, we have a similar set of debates and engagements that would be taking place on the national health insurance, for example. So if you have the Minister of Health here and the Minister of Finance here, they'll give you their respective perspectives on what do they mean, how would they fund the particular program, and what does it mean in practical terms tomorrow morning or next year, for that matter.
Minister Gordhan, may I just, to round off on this chapter, just put to you two different questions. On page 612, Minister Dlamini says the following about National Treasury, and would ask you please to comment on what is said there. Mr. President, she says, it is for this reason that I have elaborated in such depth on this policy matter, as it appears that some in the National Treasury are opposed to the radical socio-economic transformation, which is the cornerstone of the second phase of our country's transition to meaningfully address poverty, unemployment, and inequality. Do you have a comment on that statement?
Yes, but I think the current office bearer should come and answer, not me. They say you shouldn't rule from the grave. But at an academic level or notional level, that's actual drivel, because there's a radical socio-economic transformation as the slogan, and there's what I think we explained earlier on in our testimony as the substance. And the substance about radical economic transformation is how do you change the structure of the economy so that we both make greater use of the resources we have now and the anticipated opportunities that we have, but at the same time make sure that the benefits of those changes accrue to all citizens, not to a select few. So, and the Treasury, if government policy is to work in that direction, the Treasury's job is to give effect to it. Now, Treasury is not the only department in government. So too much is being made of this. As I explained to you, Chair, in response to your question, if I remember yesterday, Department of Trade and Industry will have a particular responsibility. Mineral Resources will have other responsibilities. The Small Business Department will have yet other responsibilities. But they all should be working within a broad set of policy parameters that government itself provides.
Yes, that leads to the last point that may be made in relation to this. It's been drawn to my attention that there are passages here that talk about the political implications of financial decisions. For example, at the bottom of page 604, the allegation is made that officials of the National Treasury have very little, if any, regard to important matters that have huge political implications for the ruling party. And that sentiment is expressed elsewhere. Do you have a comment on that?
No, the National Treasury is not a planet on its own orbit. It's part of the solar system. So it's part of the governmental system. And again, you have the opportunity of Mr. Fuzile, I believe, tomorrow in your presence. So you could ask him how the National Treasury operates. But the Minister of Finance will certainly take into account political implications. That's his job. And at the same time, take into account the policy advice and the technicalities that accompany it as well. So I'm sure if you have Minister Moyane here, he'll be able to more than adequately address that.
There are further issues arising out of this, but in the interests of time, if I may move on, Chair. Would you deal then?
Although I must ask, Mr. Pretorius, what is the relationship between some of the questions and state capture? Let me leave it at that.
Yes, well, in the first place, your legal team put the document up, but I'm fully accountable for the questions arising. But it seems that the relationship of Treasury to other departments in state may or may not be related to state capture. In other words, the suggestion may be made that the at times antagonistic relationship between Treasury and other departments has its roots in other matters rather than in issues relating to state capture.
And if I may, Chair, what I am saying in summary is that the Treasury works within the broad political parameters set by the governing party, firstly. Secondly, there are sometimes, if you like, incompatibilities between a political choice and its fiscal viability, and the Treasury has the responsibility to bring that to people's attention. And that thirdly, the reason we put forward this document is to show how within government itself you could get the creation of a narrative that could falsely start accusing the Treasury and become part of the overall attack on the Treasury as well. Now, your point is fair, I would say, Chair, that you're inquiring into whether there are things that the Treasury did that might have brought this upon themselves. Now, I was there for 6.5 years. Treasury has been around for 20-odd years as well. So I accept your point that we have to reflect. I'm no longer there, so they have to reflect on some of those issues. But I can assure you that Treasury doesn't work outside of the government orbit.
Then in paragraph 129 and following, Minister, you deal with the issue of the amendment of the Financial Intelligence Centre Act. In order for us in the Commission, I hesitate to say in order for the Chair, but in order for the general public out there, perhaps some background as to what that Act entails and the issues that underlie the need to amend that Act and what happened as a consequence.
Some of these developments, Chair, occurred in the context of the what is called the post 9/11 period. So you have the 9/11 attacks in the United States, and that begins to draw attention to terror financing. And the United States has this power as the biggest economy on the globe, and the dollar being the reserve currency, meaning that most international transactions occurred through the US dollar, as many of you would know when you travel overseas. It also has legislation in the United States, the Foreign Accountability Act or something like that, which allows them to become extraterritorial. So if you are facing sanctions as a country, for example, let's use Iran as an example now, from the United States, and if South Africa or any other country does any trade in dollars with that particular country, then this particular act can begin to kick in and impact negatively on our own country. But let me go back to 2001. The attacks take place in New York. There are various responses to this, including the establishment of the Homeland Security Department. But one of the other responses was to start looking at terror financing. So the Financial Action Task Force was created. It was a sort of voluntary association of about 20, 30 countries at the time. And without boring you this late in the afternoon, that institution then began to formalize the approach to terror financing, and in particular money laundering. Now, money laundering is also of interest to ourselves, the African continent, and more generally, if you remember President Mbeki's report for the African Union on illicit flows out of Africa. And there are also illicit flows out of South Africa as well. So money that is not declared here in any way and finds its way out, but which should in fact make a contribution to the economy here. So the look at terror financing led also to a look at money laundering, and then of course illicit financial flows. And these institutions, now called financial intelligence centers, then began to emerge. And in Minister Manuel's time, the first act, I think, was passed. The institution was established. Mr. Michel was appointed as the first director of the Financial Intelligence Center, reporting into the Treasury. Subsequently, of course, there were many other interactions in this institution called FATF, and more countries joined the network as well. And they then began to develop a set of criteria which would sort of certify a country. Are your systems compatible with their requirements, and have you established all the legislation and checks and balances which they think they actually require? And that is what is contained in the Financial Intelligence Center Act. What Section 129 does is to explain a subsequent development around what are called politically exposed persons.
Paragraph 129.
Now 129.2 mentions that. And if I may read that, most controversially, the amendments introduce additional scrutiny of personal finances and transactions of so-called politically exposed persons, which in the Act are termed prominent influential persons, and their families and associates, as well as a requirement to record the beneficial owners, that is the natural persons of bank accounts. So there's two concepts here, the PEPs or PIPs and the beneficial owners. Now, very rich people and people engaging in malfeasance set up trusts, as you know, Chair. And you could have layers of trusts. So if you keep digging 5, 6, 7 layers down, you might still knock into a trust. But what this provision requires is who are the individuals that are managing ultimately this set of trusts. So who are the beneficial owners of a business or a trust or whatever the case might be. As far as the PEPs or the PIPs are concerned, attention was drawn to the fact, and this relates to the illicit financial flows as well, because we've had, for example, instances in Nigeria where a former president, I can't remember the number now, but took away billions of dollars, which has just recently been recovered to some extent as well. So these PIPs or PEPs are prominent individuals, particularly in government. I was saying to some colleagues the other day, it should also include people in the private sector, but we'll come back to that. And that they should actually receive, let's call it extra scrutiny. Now, what the Financial Intelligence Center does is that it gets reports from the financial institutions. So if account A belonging to individual B has a particular pattern suddenly emerging where over 5 years, all you'll see is a maximum 100,000 in that account, but suddenly there's deposits of 5 million, 10 million, etc., and they are disposed of fairly quickly, then those would be considered to be, in terms of the FIC Act, suspicious transactions. And that suspicious transaction must be reported to the FIC. And the FIC developed analytical capabilities to assess whether there are patterns. And it has the responsibility to also then report to, and this might become part of an interesting part of your brief as well, Chair, to report to law enforcement agencies, so particularly SARS, the Hawks, and I think the prosecuting authority as well, whose job is, if there is sufficient prima facie evidence that there's something appearing out of the ordinary, that they should actually then investigate or prosecute in that regard. I'm no expert here, but that's my simple understanding of the requirements. So partly it's global compliance with FATF and FATF requirements, and partly it's with our own requirements to understand financial flows in this country. In the Oak Bay case, the Financial Intelligence Center appended these 72 suspicious transactions, you might recall. We'll get to it at some stage. And that, I think, sent shivers down the spine, because nobody quite understood that it's possible for financial institutions to actually scrutinize patterns in accounts in the way that we did. There was some, and what we're describing in 129.3 and 129.4 is the resistance, firstly, within the security cluster, but also outside of government, and we name a few individuals in that regard, to actually allowing these amendments to go through, because the apprehension might have been that people who shouldn't be detected might be detected in terms of these sorts of practices. In 129.4, we say the former president also delayed signing the amendments into law until litigation was commenced to force him to do so.
Before you go on, Minister, there are just one or two questions, right, if I may. Would it be fair to say that the purpose of the amendments to the Financial Intelligence Center Act was to make the financial controls more comprehensive and more effective, yes, to enable the law enforcement agencies ultimately to do their work in relation to money laundering, money flows and the like?
I concur with that.
That's one of the purposes, at least, apart from international compliance. Is it also correct that the Amendment Act, and if I may lead here, Chair, for the sake of time, the Amendment Act sought to grant certain powers that would ordinarily be exercised by law enforcement agencies to the Financial Intelligence Center, search and seizure, for example?
I think it was part of the original formulation, and there were some qualifications that were then introduced, as I can recall.
Yes, and you refer to issues that arose between the security cluster and National Treasury officials or National Treasury oversight provisions, or in relation to National Treasury oversight provisions. I'm referring to paragraph 129.3. Is it correct to say that there was an attempt to move the FIC lock, stock and barrel to the security cluster, or does that statement relate to powers of the security cluster and their potential exercise by the FIC?
I think powers in the first instance, and if that succeeded, it might have moved on to other things as well. And
then if you could deal with the issues you raise in paragraph 129.5.
So
you do
here I
say
indicate,
in summary that, I don't know if you've dealt with paragraph 129.4, that although delayed, the amendments finally became part of the amended Act.
Yeah, some of this was during Minister Nene's time, and some of that during, I think, I'm just trying to recall, there were different periods in which each of these matters were dealt with, but some of it in my time as well. So that's 129.4, and 129.5 is media, and again, this refers to the earlier point I made about media campaigns. That media outlets owned by the Gupta family, ANN7 in particular, launched several determined attacks on the amendments. Commentators such as Mr. Mani, Kadima, and Ms. Baloy of the Business Council appeared before Parliament, or some of them appeared before Parliament. And again, Treasury officials can give you the details of that because they manage that exercise to oppose the provisions of the amendment.
You do say in paragraph 129.7, Minister, that the amendment bill was eventually passed into law during May 2017 under your successor, that would be Minister Gigaba.
That's right.
Then in paragraph 130, you refer again to the orchestrated campaign, as you refer to it, against you and other leaders of National Treasury within the cabinet institutions of state and on certain media and social media platforms. The detail in that regard, is that the detail that you've already given and the evidence to follow in your statement?
That's right.
Is there anything other than that that we need to have regard to?
No.
And you've already said that these issues that you've raised in what you've described as the orchestrated campaign are more than simple disagreement in the ordinary course of politics.
Yeah, politics, with respect, Chair, would involve ideological discussions or political, philosophical differences, and that would take a different form from the kind of narratives and actions that we actually saw during this particular period.
Would you then deal, perhaps we could conclude this before the break, with the charges leveled against you during October 2016? You deal with that at paragraph 131 of your statement.
So that is to repeat the point I made earlier on, that on the 11th of October 2016, the former National Director of Public Prosecutions, Mr. Abrams, announced that charges were to be brought against me, as well as former SARS Commissioner Makashula and Deputy Commissioner Pillay. The charges alleged fraud relating to Mr. Pillay's early retirement, which had been approved by myself and Mr. Makashula in 2010. And I think we have a video clip there to assist you as well, because it's quite unusual for the National Prosecutor to appear on TV and a press conference to announce charges. At 1:32, subsequent media reports revealed that Mr. Abrams had met Mr. Zuma, Mr. Mashlobo, Mr. Masuta, and Ms. Lamini at Lutuli House the day before his announcement of the charges, that is on the 10th of October 2016. Mr. Abrams explained the meeting as being held to discuss student protests with ANC leaders, but it speculated that it is unusual that the Ministers of Higher Education, Finance and Police were not present if the subject matter of the discussion was in fact the higher education issues. 133.
Documentation in relation to the issues you have just raised, the levelling of the charges and the meeting that took place on the day before the announcement of the charges, appear in the bundles at page 658 to 690 and page 692, just for the record. Then the market reaction to the
That's
announcement.
recorded in paragraph 133. Markets reacted to the announcement of Mr. Abrams as follows. The rand weakened by 3.9% against the US dollar. Government bonds rose to their highest level since 2 September 2016. The cost of insuring against non-payment of debt, which are called credit default swaps, rose to the highest level since July 2016. And bank stocks fell, wiping off almost 34 billion rands in value on both the London Stock Exchange and the South African, or the JSE, or the FTSE JSE Africa Banks Index.
Minister, at the time these charges were announced and presented to the public, what were you busy doing?
Preparing for the medium-term budget policy statement. So yet another interesting coincidence.
And then what happened on the 31st of October 2016?
We heard an announcement that, as is recorded in 135, that Mr. Abrams had withdrawn the charges, stating that he was satisfied that the three accused did not have the intention to act unlawfully. I believe you call that mens rea. This was a few days before my first scheduled court appearance. I think it was the 2nd of November 2016. And various civil society and other organizations had mobilized a protest against the charges and in support of the accused.
You say in paragraph 136, Minister, that there were allegations in the public domain that political motives were at play in the decision to question and charge you and your fellow accused. And then you follow that with the following. You say, in what appeared to be yet another attempt to force me to resign, to create uncertainty and instability, and ultimately to enable the capture of the Treasury. Those latter words, do those constitute your view?
Yes.
As opposed to merely allegations in the public domain?
So I repeat the point, Chair, that I made earlier on, which is that the lessons of the dismissal of Mr. Nene, i.e. the turbulence, the depreciation of the rand, the impact on the bonds and so on, and the losses on the stock exchange, were not forgotten during the course of 2016. Of course, they seem to have been forgotten in early 2017, but that's a different matter. That the only way to, inverted commas, get rid of some of us was now to continue with this campaign of harassment charges and accompanied by a well-orchestrated media stroke digital campaign as well. And that was against a very well-held resolution or resoluteness amongst ourselves that we were not going to resign and that we would do the job that we need to do, as is evident from the delivery of both the MTBPS speech in October and the budget speech early in February 2017.
Chair, it is now 4 o'clock. You did raise with the legal team the possibility of continuing until 5 at the request of the witness. However, may we adjourn until tomorrow? And I have been given an estimate of 1.5 hours to allow us, in addition, to deal with the Treasury witnesses who are going to be called tomorrow.
Okay. No, that's fine. I also had in mind, as I mentioned to you, that maybe if need be we could go up to 5 o'clock, but that was subject to the convenience of everybody, particularly the witness who has been on the witness stand since yesterday. So we will stop here. But before we stop for the day, Minister, how much time was left before you were to deliver the medium-term budget policy statement in 2016, October 2016, when the charges were announced?
So charges were
more
announced,
or less.
Charges were announced on the 11th. The MTBPS is normally in the third week on a Wednesday of October. So we are the 20-something of that.
So it was about a week or a week and a half, or at most 2 weeks?
Maximum 2 weeks, but
Yeah.
slightly less than 2 weeks.
Yeah. And do you remember how much time there was left before you were to deliver the budget when the 27 questions were asked, were delivered to you?
Oh, 4 days or 5 days.
Yeah.
In fact, in terms of working days, probably 3.
Yes. Yes. Thank you. We will adjourn for the day. Mr. Pretorius, in terms of tomorrow, with Mr. Fuzile and any other witness that may come after him, how long do you expect us to take? Should we start earlier than normal to finish Mr. Gordhan's evidence, or should we start at normal time?
I understand from Advocate Maleka, who is leading the 3 witnesses, or at least 1 or 2 of the 3 witnesses, that it won't disrupt proceedings if we take 1.5 hours of the day, because there are 2 days reserved for the 3 Treasury witnesses.
Okay, okay.
Thank you, Chair.
All right, we'll adjourn for the day, and then we will resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you,
We
Chair.
adjourn. Thank you.
And so that was the second day of testimony by the Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan, speaking about the long journey that I think he would probably describe it as, of once forces, as he was hinting, started working towards him, harassing him, using the media, carefully orchestrated maneuvers to get rid of people that this certain grouping didn't want.
Yeah, most importantly, Peter, and regarding the interaction with the Gupta families, I think that is what many people were looking forward to. The minister really saying that he's never made any visits to the Saxon World compound, and he also made mention of the New Age post-budget breakfast back in 2016, which was cancelled, basically saying that that might have contributed to his dismissal, the fact that they had cancelled that. So, yeah, he continued to say that he actually refused to take part in the then Minister Zwane's attempts to intervene with the big banks when they closed Gupta accounts. So a lot of revelations really coming to the fore today.
And also indirectly responding to accusations being levelled against him by the EFF and the Black First, Land First movement, saying that I've done nothing wrong. Will those people outside come inside the room, present evidence under oath, and bring proof? He says that I've been to 2 inquiries and spoke under oath. And so it continues, and we'll see him again tomorrow. It's been a busy day for Minister Pravin Gordhan.
A very strong statement that the minister made this morning when he said he's not up for sale.
Exactly.
Even the Guptas do know that. All right, we're taking a quick break here on